1973, the entire United States was engulfed in the deliverance craze. The hit song Dueling Banjos swept the charts, raking in millions of dollars and turning the banjo into a new cultural icon. But in the shadows of that glitz and glamour, a crime was unfolding. While Hollywood was profiting from the blood and sweat of others, where was the father of the melody? Don Reno? He was stranded on a deserted highway at 3 a.m. Beside his loyal collaborator Bill Harrell, Don Reno sat in his dilapidated The Green Hornet bus. Bill Harrell was awake too, having voluntarily traded a life of comfort to ride shotgun on this suicide mission for art. He sat there not as a subordinate, but as the steady anchor keeping Reno's ship of fire from consuming itself. Beside him, Reno's genius hands were stained with grease from engine repairs, counting the sweat-soaked coins from a cheap fare performance. The history of bluegrass is not a legend, it is a crime scene. Earl Scruggs stole the crown, Hollywood stole the song, and Don Reno and Bill Harrell received only hard labor in return. This is the story of two men who raced their entire lives to reclaim the #1 spot, only to be cruelly tripped by fate right before the finish line. The world that forged Don Reno was a hard, unforgiving place. He was born in 1927 in Spartanburg, South Carolina, but his formative years were spent in the shadow of the Great Depression. This was not the romanticized South of Gone with the Wind. This was the South of the textile mills and the tenant farms. It was a world of lintheads, the derogatory term for the workers who spent 12 hours a day in the cotton mills, inhaling fiber dust until their lungs turned to concrete. It was a world of calloused hands, sun-bleached denim, and a silence that hung heavy over the fields. In this environment, you were defined by your utility. If you were a man, you worked the land or you worked the machines. If you were a child, you learned to do the same as soon as you were able to walk. There was very little room for softness, for art, for dreams that extended beyond the county line. But there was one escape valve, one thing that kept the crushing weight of poverty from breaking the spirit of the people: the Saturday night barn dance. Music in the rural Carolinas was a utility, just like a plow or a hammer. It was the thing that reset the clock. It was the thing that allowed people to shake off the misery of the week. And the instrument that ruled these gatherings was the banjo. But the banjo of the 1930s was not the machine gun instrument we know today. Back then, it was primarily a rhythm instrument. It was played in a style called clawhammer or frailing, a percussive brushing style where the player struck the strings with the back of the fingernail. It was hypnotic and driving, but it was limited. It was a drum on a stick. It provided the beat for the fiddle, which did all the melodic work. The banjo player was the clown, the sidekick, the guy who made funny faces and kept the rhythm, while the fiddle player got the glory. But young Don Reno heard something different. Even as a boy growing up on a farm in Clyde, North Carolina, he had an ear that was attuned to a different frequency. He didn't just hear the rhythm, he heard the potential for melody. He looked at that round, tensioned drum head and those 5 metal strings, and he didn't see a toy. He saw a puzzle waiting to be solved. He was a prodigy, though they didn't use words like that in Clyde. He picked up the instrument at age 5. By age 9, he was already playing better than grown men. But the pivotal moment, the spark that would eventually ignite a revolution, came when he saw a local legend named Snuffy Jenkins. Snuffy Jenkins is a name that has largely been lost to the casual history books, but in the genealogy of the banjo, he is a patriarch. Jenkins didn't play the old clawhammer style. He played with 2 fingers, picking upward, creating a sound that was sharper, cleaner, and faster. When young Don Reno saw Jenkins play, it was like watching a magician reveal a secret. The banjo didn't have to be a drum. It could be a trumpet. It could be a piano. It could sing. Reno took that inspiration and ran with it. He locked himself away, practicing with an obsessive intensity that bordered on madness. He wasn't satisfied with 2 fingers. He began to experiment with 3, the thumb, the index, and the middle finger. This was the holy grail of banjo playing, a technique that allowed for rolling, continuous arpeggios that created a wall of sound. He was figuring out the geometry of the fretboard, mapping out the neck in his mind, realizing that he could play complex, jazz-inflected scales if he just moved his fingers fast enough. By the time he was a teenager in the early 1940s, Don Reno was a terrifying talent. He was playing with a speed and dexterity that was simply unheard of. He was playing on local radio stations in Spartanburg, and the phone lines would light up with people asking, "Who is that boy? And how is he doing that?" He was barely old enough to shave, yet he was already a local celebrity, a hotshot who could cut heads with musicians twice his age. It felt like destiny. It felt like the universe was aligning to place Don Reno on the throne. The world of country music was shifting. The old, slow, sentimental ballads were giving way to a faster, more aggressive sound. A man named Bill Monroe was making waves in Nashville with a high-powered, driving style of music that would eventually be called Bluegrass. And Bill Monroe was looking for soldiers for his revolution. In 1943, the call came. It is the moment every musician dreams of, the moment the clouds part and the hand of God reaches down to pull you out of obscurity. Bill Monroe, the father of Bluegrass, the most demanding and respected band leader in the business, had heard the rumors about the kid from South Carolina. He had heard about the speed, the precision, the strange new 3-finger roll that sounded like a stream of water rushing over stones. Monroe approached Reno. The offer was simple. "I want you to be my banjo player. Stop and consider the weight of this." In 1943, joining Bill Monroe's Bluegrass Boys was not just a job. It was an anointing. It was the equivalent of joining the Beatles in 1962 or Miles Davis in 1958. It meant you were going to the Grand Ole Opry. It meant your name would be broadcast across the nation on the WSM radio signal, reaching millions of homes. It meant you were going to be the person who introduced the world to the modern banjo. Don Reno was ready. He had the talent. He had the drive. He had the invitation. The history books were open. The pen was hovering over the page, ready to write, "Don Reno, the king of the banjo." But history is not written by talent alone. It is written by timing. And in 1943, the timing of the world was set to the ticking of a doomsday clock. Just as Reno was preparing to pack his bags for Nashville, to step onto the stage of the Ryman Auditorium and claim his birthright, another letter arrived in the mail. It wasn't a contract from the Opry. It was a letter from the United States government. "Greetings," it began. "The draft." World War II was raging. The Pacific Theater was a meat grinder, consuming young American men by the thousands. The Army didn't care about arpeggios. They didn't care about 3-finger rolls or the revolution of country music. They needed bodies. They needed riflemen. And Don Reno, the chosen one of Bluegrass, was just another number in the lottery of war. The devastation of this moment cannot be overstated. Reno had to look at Bill Monroe, his idol, his ticket to immortality, and say no. He had to hand back the golden ticket. "I have to go," Reno said. "My country is calling." Monroe, a pragmatic man who needed a banjo player now, couldn't wait. The show had to go on. The tour dates were booked. The radio slots were sold. He told Reno he was sorry, wished him luck, and began looking for a replacement. And so, Don Reno traded his banjo for an M1 Garand rifle. He traded the spotlight of the Grand Ole Opry for the mud and blood of the jungle. He was shipped out to the China-Burma India Theater, often called the Forgotten Front of the war. But there was nothing forgettable about the horror Reno endured there. He became a member of the legendary Merrill's Marauders, a long-range penetration special operations jungle warfare unit. These men weren't just soldiers, they were ghosts, marching hundreds of miles through dense, disease-ridden jungles, fighting the Japanese Imperial Army in brutal close-quarters combat, while Reno was literally crawling through the mud, dodging sniper fire, contracting malaria, and watching his friends die in the humid darkness of Burma. The world back home continued to turn. The musical revolution that he was supposed to lead didn't pause out of respect for his sacrifice. It accelerated. In Nashville, Bill Monroe found his replacement. He found another young man from North Carolina, a shy, soft-spoken kid who had also figured out a three-finger style of playing. His name was Earl Scruggs. In 1945, while Don Reno was recovering from the physical and psychological wounds of war, Earl Scruggs stepped up to the microphone at the Grand Ole Opry. He wore a crisp suit and a cowboy hat. He smiled shyly at the audience, and then he launched into a tune called Foggy Mountain Breakdown. The impact was nuclear. The sound that Earl Scruggs produced, that driving, syncopated machine gun roll, hit the American public like a revelation. It was the sound Reno had heard in his head for years. It was the sound Reno had been perfecting in his bedroom in Clyde. But it was Earl Scruggs who was broadcasting it to the nation. The audience went insane. They had never heard anything like it. It was fast, it was exciting, it was modern. Overnight, Earl Scruggs became a god. He became the definition of the banjo. The style was named after him, Scruggs style. Thousands of miles away, Don Reno eventually received the news. He heard the recordings. He heard the cheers that were meant for him. He realized with a sinking feeling in his gut that the seat he had vacated had not just been filled, it had been conquered. The history that was supposed to be his was being written by another man. When Reno finally returned to American soil in 1948, he came back as a hero of the war, but a ghost in the music world. He was a man out of time. He had survived the jungle, but he had lost his destiny. He walked into a world where Earl Scruggs was a household name. Don Reno was just a question mark, a what if, a footnote in a chapter that had already been closed. Imagine the psychological scars. Most men in his position would have been crushed. Most men would have looked at Scruggs' success and said, "I missed the boat, I'll just go work at the mill." Or they would have done what every other banjo player in America was doing. They would have learned to copy Earl Scruggs note for note, hoping to catch a few crumbs from the master's table. But Don Reno was not most men. He was a marauder. He was a survivor. And he possessed a stubborn, burning pride that would not allow him to be a clone. As he stood there in 1948, looking at the mountain Earl Scruggs had climbed, Reno made a decision that would shape the rest of his tragic, brilliant life. He decided he wouldn't climb Scruggs' mountain. He would build his own, brick by bloody brick, even if it killed him. He looked at his hands, hands that had held a rifle and killed men, and decided to turn them into weapons of a different kind. If the world wanted Earl Scruggs, fine. He would give them something Earl Scruggs could never play. He would give them the impossible. The air in 1948 tasted of coal smoke and victory, but for Don Reno it tasted like ash. He stood on the precipice of a new America, a country flush with post-war optimism and booming industry. Yet he felt entirely out of step with the rhythm of the times. The radio, that glowing wooden box in the corner of every living room, was a constant torment. Every time he turned the dial, he heard the ghost of the life he was supposed to live. He heard the rapid-fire, syncopated rolls of Earl Scruggs playing Molly and Ten Brooks or Blue Moon of Kentucky. To the average listener, it was just exciting new music. To Don Reno, it was the sound of a thief living in his house. It would have been easy to surrender. The path of least resistance was laid out clearly before him. Admit defeat, buy a ticket to Nashville, swallow his pride, and learn to play exactly like Earl Scruggs. That was what every other banjo player from Virginia to Kentucky was doing. They were slowing down their records, dissecting Scruggs' rolls note by note, turning themselves into photocopies of the master. If Reno had done that, he likely could have found steady work. He could have been a respected sideman, a reliable clone who paid the bills by giving the audience exactly what they wanted. But the war had changed Don Reno. You do not trek through the Burmese jungle, watching friends die in the mud and starving on meager rations, only to come home and imitate another man. The trauma of the war had calcified his pride into something hard and unbreakable. He decided with a cold and burning resolve that he would rather fail as Don Reno than succeed as a second-rate Earl Scruggs. If Scruggs was the smooth rolling river of bluegrass, Reno decided he would be the jagged lightning bolt. If Scruggs was the flow, Reno would be the interruption. He retreated into the woodshed of his own mind and began to construct a style of playing that defied the logic of the instrument. The banjo is designed for arpeggios, rolling chords that blend together. It is not designed for the staccato linear runs of a jazz guitar. But Reno didn't care about the instrument's limitations. He cared about making a statement. He looked at the electric guitar players who were starting to make waves, men playing boogie-woogie and blues, and he decided to steal their fire. He developed a technique that would eventually be known as single string or Reno style. Instead of using the three-finger roll to create a wall of sound, Reno used his thumb and index finger like a flat pick. He would trade them back and forth with blinding speed. Thumb index, attacking a single string to play complex linear melodies. It was percussive. It was aggressive. It sounded less like a banjo and more like a Tommy gun. He incorporated jazz chords sliding up and down the neck, finding notes that didn't belong in hillbilly music. He was playing blues scales. He was playing boogie. He was playing the sound of a man fighting his way out of a corner. This invention was not merely a musical innovation. It was a psychological defense mechanism. Every note he played was an assertion of identity. When he stepped onto a stage and ripped into a solo, playing notes that Scruggs couldn't or wouldn't play, he was screaming to the world that he was still the king, even if he didn't have the crown. He was proving that there was more than one way to skin a cat, and his way left deeper scars. But a general needs an army, and a banjo player needs a guitarist. A virtuoso needs an anchor. In the chaotic, ego-driven world of professional musicians, finding a partner who complements your genius without threatening it is rarer than finding a diamond in a coal scuttle. Yet, in 1949, destiny finally threw Don Reno a bone. He met a tall, lanky, easygoing guitarist named Red Smiley. Red Smiley was everything Don Reno was not. If Reno was the intense, volatile, chain-smoking innovator who couldn't sit still, Red was the warm hearth. He had a voice like aged bourbon, smooth, rich, and deeply comforting. He was a rhythm guitar player of impeccable taste, known for his G-run, a bass-heavy punctuation mark that kept the band driving forward without ever rushing. He was the calm in the center of Reno's storm. They formed a partnership that would become legendary, Reno and Smiley. They called their band the Tennessee Cut-Ups, a name that hinted at their rowdy, high-energy stage presence. And for the next 15 years, they waged a musical war for the soul of bluegrass. The chemistry was instantaneous and electric. When they sang together, it wasn't just harmony, it was telepathy. Red took the lead with his velvet baritone, and Don climbed above him with a tenor voice that was sharp and piercing, cutting through the mix like a serrated knife. On stage, they were a study in contrasts. Don was the showman, grinning manically, his fingers flying across the fretboard, dancing with the banjo, pulling faces, cracking jokes. Red stood stoically beside him, smiling that gentle, knowing smile, laying down a rhythm so solid you could build a house on it. They found a home base not in Nashville, but in Roanoke, Virginia. This geographical distinction is important. Nashville was the Vatican of country music, the seat of power where Bill Monroe and Flatt and Scruggs held court. Roanoke was the frontier. It was a working-class railroad town, gritty and unpretentious. By setting up shop there and becoming the stars of the Old Dominion Barn Dance radio show, Reno and Smiley positioned themselves as the people's champions. They weren't the polished stars of the Grand Ole Opry. They were the boys next door who could play the paint off the walls. The early 1950s were their golden era. They churned out records that are now considered cornerstones of the genre. Songs like I'm Using My Bible for a Roadmap became anthems, showcasing their ability to blend gospel piety with driving rhythm. But it was the instrumentals that truly set them apart. While Flatt and Scruggs were refining the traditional sound, Reno and Smiley were blowing it apart. They recorded tunes like Choking the Strings and Dixie Breakdown, tracks where Reno's banjo sounded less like a folk instrument and more like a musical seizure. He would bend the strings, choke them, silence them, and explode them, creating sound effects that mimicked chickens, trains, and police sirens. It was vaudeville meets virtuosity. In 1955, deep in a recording session that seemed routine at the time, they laid down a track that would become the ticking time bomb of Don Reno's life. He and a local television personality and musician named Arthur Guitar Boogie Smith sat down to record a novelty instrumental. It was a musical conversation, a back-and-forth argument between a banjo and a guitar. They called it Dueling Banjos. At the time, it was just another clever tune in Reno's vast repertoire. It was catchy, funny, and showcased his ability to mimic the guitar. They released it, it got some airplay, and then, like thousands of other songs, it faded into the archives. Reno didn't think much of it. He certainly didn't know that he had just recorded the blueprint for his own future misery. He didn't know that this simple tune would, 20 years later, be stripped of his name, renamed Dueling Banjos, and used to make other men millionaires while he scraped for change. In 1955, it was just a day's work. Throughout the decade, the rivalry between the camps was fierce. In the minds of bluegrass fans, you were either a Scruggs man or a Reno man. It was the Beatles versus the Stones of the Appalachian Mountains. Scruggs was the Beatles, polished, melodic, universally loved. Reno was the Stones, dangerous, rougher, willing to get dirty. But while the artistic contest was a draw, the commercial contest was a rout. Flatt and Scruggs had the Martha White Flower sponsorship. They had the syndicated television show. They had the machine of Nashville behind them. Reno and Smiley had a bus that broke down and a radio signal that faded when you drove too far west. Reno felt this disparity keenly. He knew he was playing things Scruggs couldn't dream of. He was writing songs with complex chord progressions that borrowed from the great American songbook, pushing the genre into sophisticated territory that critics wouldn't appreciate for decades. But the big money never came. They made a living, a good living, by the standards of the day, but they were working class rich, not star rich. They bought nice cars, they bought houses, but they paid for them with blood and sweat. mile by grueling mile, and then the wind changed. By the late 1950s, a new sound was coming out of Memphis. A truck driver named Elvis Presley had taken the energy of bluegrass, mixed it with the rhythm of blues, and created a monster that would eat country music alive: rock and roll. Overnight, the market for banjos and fiddles evaporated. Radio stations that had once welcomed Reno and Smiley with open arms now wanted electric guitars and drums. The bookings started to dry up, the crowds got thinner. The Old Dominion barn dance began to feel like a relic. The pressure of maintaining a band in a dying market began to take its toll, not just on the bank accounts, but on the bodies. The road is a cruel mistress. She demands payment in health. Red Smiley, the gentle giant, began to crumble. He was battling diabetes in an era when management of the disease was rudimentary at best. The lifestyle of a touring musician, late nights, terrible food, irregular sleep, stress, is poison to a diabetic. Reno watched his partner, his musical soulmate, begin to fade. Red lost weight. His energy flagged. The sparkle in his eye dimmed. It was a slow-motion tragedy. Reno tried to shoulder the burden, driving more miles, handling more business, trying to keep the ship afloat so Red could just sing and play. But you cannot outrun physiology. In 1964, the inevitable happened. The doctors told Red Smiley that if he didn't get off the road, he would die. The partnership that had defined the sound of Virginia bluegrass, that had stood as the only legitimate challenger to the Nashville throne, was over. Red retired to a quiet life of local TV shows and fishing. Don Reno was left alone on the stage. He was 37 years old, a dangerous age for a musician, too old to be a prodigy, too young to be a patriarch. He looked out at a musical landscape that had become hostile. The folk revival was happening, but the college kids wanted old, authentic mountain men, not slick virtuosos in matching suits. The country charts were dominated by the Nashville sound, lush strings and smooth choruses. There was no place for a frenetic, jazz-playing banjo player without a partner. The silence on the bus was deafening without Red's laughter. The passenger seat was empty. Don Reno felt the familiar cold grip of isolation that he hadn't felt since the foxholes of Burma. He was the greatest banjo player in the world, and he didn't have a band, didn't have a label, and didn't have a plan. He tried to reinvent himself. He teamed up with Bill Harrell, a pragmatic, steady musician who could sing the tenor parts and keep the rhythm going. It was a sensible move. It saved his career. But it was the beginning of a different kind of life. The fire of the Reno and Smiley years was gone, replaced by the steady pilot light of survival. Reno and Harrell would spend the next decade as the workhorses of the circuit. They were respected, they were employed, but they were trapped in the amber of the past. They became a legacy act before Reno was even 40. They played the songs people wanted to hear, they smiled, they signed autographs. But inside the bus, now growing older and rustier with every mile, Don Reno sat looking out the window at a country that was speeding past him. Yet before the final darkness fell, there was a decade of light. In 1966, destiny intervened. Enter Bill Harrell. To understand the tragedy of this story, you must understand who Bill Harrell was. He was a paradox in the world of hillbilly music, a man of letters in a world of oral tradition, holding a degree from the University of Maryland. He had a stable career, a pension, and a quiet suburban life mapped out. He was the sane man in an insane business. But Harrell saw something in Don Reno's wild eyes. He heard the magic in hands that the rest of the world was ignoring. In an act of reckless love for the music, Bill Harrell chose to abandon his security. He traded his suit and tie for a seat on a sinking ship. He became Reno's bodyguard, his confidant, and the anchor in the storm. When they joined forces to form Don Reno, Bill Harrell, and the Tennessee Cut-Ups, it wasn't just a marriage of convenience. It was a brotherhood forged in the trenches. For the next 10 years, from 1966 to 1976, Reno and Harrell became the dynamic duo of bluegrass. They were two generals commanding the same army. If Reno was the lightning, Harrell was the conductor that kept it from burning the house down. Reno was volatile, prone to moods and artistic seizures. Harrell was the granite rock, steady and immovable. His rhythm guitar work was the heartbeat that allowed Reno's banjo to race without faltering. But more importantly, Harrell was the diplomat. He smoothed the feathers Reno ruffled. He managed the money when Reno wanted to spend it. He was the sanity that allowed the insanity to flourish. While the rest of the world was turning to psychedelic rock and electric guitars, Reno and Harrell stood back to back, defending the purity of their sound. They traveled in the legendary Green Hornet, a 1946 flexible bus that became a symbol of their resilience. To the outside world, that old bus might have looked like a torture chamber, but to them, it was a battleship. Inside that bus, amidst the diesel fumes and the miles, there was laughter, camaraderie, and a shared mission to keep the music alive. They were incredibly successful in their own right. They released album after album, blending Harrell's traditional sensibilities with Reno's jazz-inflected genius. They didn't just survive, they reigned as kings on the festival circuit, earning the respect of fans and peers alike. They proved that two distinct styles could coexist in perfect harmony. But as the mid-1970s approached, the call of blood began to whisper to Don Reno. His sons, Ronnie, Dale, and Don Wayne, were growing up. They were becoming musicians in their own right, talented and eager. Reno looked at his boys and saw a fleeting window of time. He realized that if he wanted to build a legacy with his own flesh and blood, he had to do it now, before they were grown and gone. The breakup in 1976 was not a war, it was a graduation. There were no lawyers, no shouting matches, no bitterness over money. It was a conversation between two best-ians. Don Reno told Bill Harrell that he needed to spend his final years playing with his sons. He wanted to be a father on stage, not just a partner. Bill Harrell, a man of immense class and understanding, didn't try to hold him back. This was the measure of the man. Harrell had saved Reno's career. He had given 10 years of his prime to rebuild a legend. He had every right to be furious, to demand loyalty in return for the stability he had provided. Instead, he saw the longing in his friend's eyes, the desperate need of a father to connect with his sons before time ran out. Harrell swallowed his own pride, buried his own uncertainty about the future, and gave Reno the greatest gift one friend can give another. He let him go without guilt. He understood that the bond of family supersedes the bond of business. They shook hands, hugged, and parted ways as brothers. Harrell went on to form his own successful band, the Virginians, while Reno turned the wheel toward his final adventure, Don Reno and Sons. It was a decision made not out of conflict, but out of love, a father choosing his children over his safety net. The dream of Don Reno and Sons was a romantic, intoxicating vision. It was the stuff of country music legend, the patriarch standing center stage, flanked by his progeny, passing the torch of genius in real time. It was meant to be his answer to the Carter family, his rebuttal to the Scruggs dynasty. He imagined a band where the telepathy wasn't just musical, but genetic. He imagined a unit that moved with a single mind, where he didn't have to compromise his artistic vision for the sake of a partner's comfort. He would be the undisputed captain, and his boys would be his loyal lieutenants. And for a brief, shining moment in the rehearsal room, the dream felt real. His sons, Ronnie, Dale, and Don Wayne, were undeniably talented. They had grown up in a house where the banjo was not an instrument, but a member of the family. They understood the peculiar, syncopated language of their father's music better than any hired gun ever could. When they harmonized, their voices blended with that spooky, resonant quality that only siblings possess. Reno felt a surge of vitality he hadn't felt since the early days with Red Smiley. He wasn't just a banjo player anymore. He was a father building a legacy. But the road does not care about romance. The road cares about logistics. And as 1977 dawned, the harsh reality of Don Reno's decision began to set in with the brutality of a winter frost. The first blow was the silence of the telephone. For a decade, the phone had rung because Bill Harrell made it ring. Now Reno was the one who had to make the calls. He was a legend, yes, but legends are often viewed by promoters as high maintenance, expensive, and unreliable. Without Harrell's steady hand reassuring them, the festival organizers hesitated. They wondered if Reno, known for his erratic brilliance and his chain-smoking intensity, could hold a band together on his own. They wondered if hiring a band of kids was a risk. The bookings that had been automatic for Reno and Harrell suddenly evaporated. The financial floor dropped out from under him. In the Harrell years, there was a steady, if modest, paycheck. Now the income was erratic. Some weeks they feasted, most weeks they starved. Reno was no longer just the star. He was the manager, the bus driver, the roadie, and the bank. He had to pay for the gas, the food, the hotel rooms, when they could afford them, and the equipment repairs, and he had to pay his sons. They were his children, but they were also his employees. They had lives, they had needs, and looking into their eyes when the gate money was light was a specific kind of torture that only a father can understand. The physical toll of this new independence was immediate and devastating. In the partnership, the labor had been shared. Now it all fell on Don. He was in his 50s, an age when most men are looking toward retirement, yet he was working harder than he had at 20. The glamour of the stage performance, the 45 minutes of applause and adrenaline, was the tiniest fraction of the job. The real job was the other 23 hours. It was lugging 80-pound amplifiers up narrow staircases in the back of dive bars because they couldn't afford a road crew. It was wrestling the steering wheel of a new, smaller van. The Green Hornet had finally been retired, replaced by vehicles that were equally unreliable but less spacious, through snowstorms in the Alleghenies at 4 a.m., fighting the hypnosis of the white lines because he couldn't trust anyone else to drive. It was changing flat tires on the side of the interstate, while semi-trucks roared past, shaking the chassis, the wind cutting through his thin jacket. Don Reno was a man of immense dignity. He always wore a suit on stage. He kept his hair pomaded, his shoes shined. He presented himself as a professional, but behind the curtain, he was being reduced to a beast of burden. The dissonance between his status as a musical genius and his reality as a manual laborer was a psychic wound that never healed. He was the man who had invented a new way to play the banjo, yet here he was, negotiating with a mechanic over the price of a transmission rebuild, counting out crumpled bills with grease-stained fingers, and always, hovering in the periphery of his vision like a mocking ghost, was Earl Scruggs. If the breakup with Harrell was financial suicide, the obsession with Scruggs was emotional poison. By the late 1970s, Earl Scruggs had ascended to a plane of existence that Reno could only dream of. The Earl Scruggs Review was a juggernaut. They were playing rock venues, college campuses, and massive outdoor festivals. They had a sleek, customized tour bus that didn't break down. They had a lighting rig. They had a sound crew. Earl stood center stage, stoic and silver-haired, flanked by his long-haired sons, Gary and Randy, who played electric bass and drums. They were the bridge between the old world and the new, beloved by both the Grand Ole Opry, traditionalists, and the Rolling Stone reading counterculture. Reno watched this from a distance, and it ate him alive. He saw Scruggs doing exactly what he was trying to do, playing with his sons, modernizing the sound, building a dynasty. But Scruggs was being hailed as a visionary, while Reno was struggling to get booked at a county fair. He would see Scruggs on television playing to a stadium crowd, the camera panning over thousands of adoring faces. Then Reno would look around the venue he was playing, a dimly lit VFW hall with peeling paint, a half-empty room of older folks drinking cheap beer, the sound of a ceiling fan clicking rhythmically overhead. The injustice of it felt physical. He knew, deep in the marrow of his bones, that he could play things Scruggs couldn't touch. He knew his single-string style was more complex, more adaptable to the rock and jazz idioms that the kids loved. Why couldn't they hear it? Why was he the relic and Scruggs the revolutionary? This bitterness seeped into the music. The Don Reno and Sons era produced some frantic, aggressive recordings. Reno played with a chip on his shoulder, the size of a mountain. He pushed tempos to breaking points. He engaged in musical duels with his sons on stage, cutting heads with them, driving them to play faster, harder, louder. It wasn't the relaxed, joyful interplay of a family jam session. It was a desperate assertion of dominance. He was proving night after night to an empty room or a full one that he was still the king, even if he was ruling over a kingdom of ash. The stress began to manifest in his body. The human hand is a miracle of engineering, but it is not a machine. It consists of delicate tendons, ligaments, and small bones. It is not designed to perform the repetitive, high-impact trauma of banjo playing for 40 years without consequence. Arthritis is a cruel thief. It doesn't take everything at once. It steals by degrees. It starts as a dull ache in the morning, a stiffness that requires a little extra warming up. Then it becomes a sharp stab when the weather changes. Then it becomes a constant grinding background noise, a signal flare of pain with every note. For Don Reno, whose entire identity was predicated on dexterity, on the ability to move his thumb and index finger faster than the eye could follow, the onset of arthritis was terrifying. It was the musician's equivalent of a sniper going blind. He kept it a secret. He told no one, not even his sons, about the severity of the pain. To admit weakness was to invite the end. Instead, he developed rituals of survival. Before a show, he would retreat to a bathroom sink, running the water until it was nearly boiling. He would submerge his hands, grimacing as the heat penetrated the swollen joints, desperately trying to thaw the bone-deep stiffness, just enough to survive one more performance. He would stand there, staring into the dirty mirror of a backstage restroom, his hands burning in the water, his face gray with exhaustion, summoning the will to go out there and be the world's fastest banjo player. When he stepped on stage, the adrenaline would mask the pain for a while. He would smile, he would crack jokes, he would launch into Limehouse blues or follow the leader, and the notes would fly out. But afterward, in the van, as the adrenaline crashed, his hands would throb with a pulse of their own. He would cradle them in his lap like injured birds, unable to grip the steering wheel, forced to let one of the boys drive while he stared into the darkness, wondering how many more shows were left in the tank. The late 1970s brought another enemy, the economy. The United States was in the grip of stagflation. Gas prices skyrocketed during the energy crisis. For a touring band that lived on the highway, the price of diesel was not a political talking point. It was a matter of life and death. The profit margins, already razor thin, vanished completely. There were nights when the math simply didn't work. They would drive 500 miles to play a gig for $300. After gas, food, and a cheap motel room where they would stack 4 guys into 2 beds to save money, there was nothing left. Reno began to dip into his meager savings. He borrowed money, he cut corners, he stopped repairing the equipment unless it was absolutely critical. The band looked ragged, the suits were fraying, the glamour was gone. Yet amidst this squalor and desperation, the music itself underwent a strange transformation. Stripped of the commercial constraints of the Harrell era, stripped of the need to play it safe, Don Reno's playing became wilder, more experimental. He began writing songs that were intricate, almost baroque in their complexity. He was playing for himself now. He was playing to exorcise the demons. While his body betrayed him, the injustice of his legacy haunted him. Dueling Banjos had become a global phenomenon, ringing out from televisions and radios everywhere, yet Reno remained a ghost in his own masterpiece. Although Arthur Smith eventually won the legal battle against Warner Brothers, the settlement was a hollow victory. It wasn't retire and comfort money. It was barely enough to fix the van's transmission. The industry had simply paid a fee to make the problem go away, leaving Reno as the invisible man behind the curtain while Hollywood took the bow. This lack of recognition was the poison in the well. It wasn't just about money, it was about legacy. Don Reno was a man who cared deeply about his place in history. He knew he was as good as Bill Monroe. He knew he was better, technically, than Earl Scruggs. But everywhere he looked, he saw Scruggs being canonized while he was being erased. By the early 1980s, Earl Scruggs had become a living monument. He was the recipient of honors from the Smithsonian. He was featured in documentaries about American culture. His collaborative album, Will the Circle Be Unbroken, was considered a masterpiece that bridged the generation gap. Scruggs was the benevolent grandfather of the banjo, beloved by rock stars and country stars alike. Reno watched this canonization from the driver's seat of a rusted Ford van. He compared his life to Earl's, and the discrepancy broke his heart. Why was Earl the chosen one? Was it just the timing of the war? Was it the suit and tie? Was it the connection to Lester Flatt? Reno tortured himself with these questions. He felt he had been blacklisted by destiny. He began to feel a desperate urgency to record, to get his music down on tape before his hands failed completely. He wanted to leave a document that proved once and for all who he was. He went into the studio with his sons, the Reno brothers, and recorded a series of albums for small independent labels like CMH. These late recordings are painful and beautiful. They lack the manic, youthful energy of the 1950s, Reno and Smiley sides, but they possess a dark, autumnal power. Reno dug deep into his bag of tricks. He played jazz standards. He played gospel. He wrote new instrumentals that were incredibly dense and difficult, as if he were daring the arthritis to stop him. In songs like Drifting with the Tide, you can hear the melancholy. You can hear a man reflecting on a life spent in motion, carried by currents he couldn't control. The tone of his banjo in these years became darker, more percussive. He wasn't playing for the applause anymore. He was playing for the archives. He was carving his name into the wax, hoping that someday someone would listen and understand. But the industry was indifferent. The 1980s country music machine was gearing up for a slick, pop-oriented revolution. The urban cowboy movement was bringing mechanical bulls and soft rock ballads to the charts. There was zero interest in an aging bluegrass legend playing eccentric, jazz-inflected banjo tunes. The records were pressed in small quantities. They were sold at the merchandise tables, at festivals. They didn't chart. They didn't get reviewed in Rolling Stone. They were messages in bottles thrown into a vast and uncaring ocean. The burden on his sons, Ronnie, Dale, and Don Wayne, during this time was immense. They were watching their father disintegrate. They saw the pain in his face every time he lifted a heavy speaker cabinet. They saw the way he leaned against the van, catching his breath, his chest heaving, his face pale. They knew he shouldn't be working. They knew he should be sitting on a porch somewhere, teaching his grandkids to pick. But they also knew the terrifying math of the family finances. There was no nest egg. There were no royalties from the radio hits of the 50s. Those contracts had been exploitative, paying pennies. If Don Reno stopped playing, the lights went out. The house would be lost. The family would be destitute. So the sons became the caregivers. They took over the driving. They carried the equipment. They covered for him on stage, taking longer solos, extending the vocal harmonies to give the old man a break. They became his bodyguards, protecting him from the harsh realities of the road, trying to create a bubble of comfort around him. It was a reversal of the natural order. The father is supposed to provide for the sons. But in the Reno family, the sons were propping up the father, literally and metaphorically. They played with a fierce loyalty, honoring him with every note, trying to give him the dynasty he had dreamed of, even as the kingdom crumbled around them. The death of a miner metaphor is not accidental. Don Reno was a blue-collar worker in the truest sense. He didn't mind coal, he mined notes. He went down into the dark shaft of his own creativity every single day and hauled up buckets of joy for other people. He gave the world the soundtrack to its happiness, its movies, its car rides, and like a miner, he contracted the occupational disease. For a coal miner, it is black lung, the dust settling in the chest, hardening the tissues, stealing the breath. For Don Reno, it was the cumulative trauma of the road. It was the stress that hardened his arteries. It was the smoke that coated his lungs. It was the vibration of the steering wheel that destroyed his nerves. He was dying of his work. There is a specific moment from this era that captures the tragedy in a single frame. It was 1982. The band was playing a small outdoor festival in rural Virginia. It had rained for 2 days straight. The field was a quagmire of mud. The crowd was sparse, huddling under umbrellas, miserable and wet. Don Reno walked onto the makeshift stage, which was little more than plywood sheets on cinder blocks. He was wearing his best suit, a light blue polyester number that he had kept pressed and clean. He looked frail. His skin had a translucent, papery quality. He strapped on his banjo, the weight of the heavy tone ring pulling his shoulder down. He stepped to the microphone. The rain drummed on the tin roof of the stage. He looked out at the 50 or 60 people standing in the mud. He could have phoned it in. He could have played a 20-minute set and gone back to the van. Nobody would have blamed him. But Don Reno didn't know how to do that. He smiled, a genuine smile this time, and launched into Limehouse Blues. He attacked the strings with a ferocity that shocked the band. He played the single-string runs with a clarity that cut through the damp air like a laser. He closed his eyes and swayed, lost in the music, transcending the mud, the pain, the poverty, the injustice. For 3 minutes, he wasn't a broke old man in a muddy field. He was the king. He was playing jazz in Paris. He was playing the Opry. He was playing for God. When the song ended, there was a moment of silence before the scattered applause began. Reno opened his eyes, blinked, and seemed to shrink back into his body. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand, adjusted his strap, and said, "Thank you, folks. We're glad to be here." He gave them everything he had, knowing he would pay for it in agony later that night. He gave it away for free, because that was what he was born to do. As 1983 approached, the shadows lengthened. The coughing fits became worse. He started having trouble catching his breath after walking short distances. The doctors warned him, They told him his heart was weak, that his arteries were clogged, that he was a walking time bomb. They told him to stop smoking, to stop eating fried food, to stop stressing. They might as well have told him to stop breathing. The road was his life. The stress was his fuel. To stop was to die anyway. He began to talk more about the past. He told stories to his sons about the old days with Snuffy Jenkins, about the war in Burma, about the nights in Roanoke with Red Smiley. He was performing a life review, trying to make sense of the journey. He seemed haunted by the idea that he would be forgotten. "Don't let them forget the single string," he would tell his boys. "Don't let them say I just copied Earl." It was the plea of a man who knew the end was coming and feared that his tombstone would be blank. He wanted credit, not fame necessarily, but credit. He wanted the world to know that he had been there, that he had changed things, that he had mattered. But the world was busy. The radio was playing synthesizer pop. The banjo was uncool again, and Don Reno was just an old man in a van, driving through the night, racing against a clock that had already run out of time. The final curtain was about to fall, not with a grand finale, but with the quiet, devastating collapse of a machine that had been run at maximum RPM for too long. The miner was running out of air, the tunnel was closing in, and the song was about to end. The darkness that had been gathering at the edges of Don Reno's vision for years finally closed in during the autumn of 1984. The road, which had been his home, his workplace, and his master for nearly 4 decades, finally ran out of pavement. It is a terrible thing to watch a machine that was built for speed slowly grind to a halt, gears stripping, smoke rising, until it simply ceases to function. But it is far more tragic to watch a human being, specifically a human being defined by kinetic energy and frantic brilliance, succumb to the static silence of mortality. By this time, even his brutal survival rituals began to fail. The scalding water soaks that once bought him 45 minutes of fluidity were no longer enough. The arthritis was winning. He was no longer just warming up, he was fighting a losing battle against his own anatomy, forcing stone-like joints to move through sheer willpower, hiding the agony behind a mask of stylistic choices. The tragedy was that his mind was as sharp as ever. In his head he could still hear the lightning-fast runs, the complex jazz substitutions, the chromatic scales that cascaded like water. He could hear the music perfectly, but there was a growing, terrifying delay between the impulse in his brain and the execution of his fingers. He had to adjust. He had to simplify. He had to use his immense knowledge of the fretboard to find easier ways to play the hard passages. He became a magician of economy, using 3 notes where he used to use 10, hiding the physical decline behind a mask of stylistic choice. But the audience, the hardcore bluegrass fans who analyzed every lick, they noticed. They saw the grimace that flickered across his face when he reached for a high chord. They heard the slight stumble in the rhythm during a fast breakdown. They whispered in the parking lots. "Don's slowing down," they would say. "He's losing it." They didn't say it with malice, but with a kind of sad reverence, like watching an old prize fighter take one too many punches. They didn't know about the hot water. They didn't know that every note was a victory over agony. They just knew the machine was breaking down. He continued to book shows. He continued to load the van. He continued to put on the suit. There is a specific kind of heroism in this refusal to yield, but it is a heroism tinged with horror. It is the boxer who climbs back into the ring long after his legs are gone, not because he thinks he can win, but because fighting is the only language he speaks. Reno played through the spring and summer of 1984, his performances becoming erratic, his stamina vanishing. The audiences, loyal to the end, watched with a mixture of adoration and heartbreak. They saw the man who had once leaped around the stage with Red Smiley now sitting on a stool, his breath coming in shallow rasps between songs, his face pale and clammy under the stage lights. He was literally dying on stage. The final collapse did not happen in a blaze of glory. It didn't happen during a sold-out concert at Carnegie Hall or on the Grand Ole Opry stage. It happened in the quiet, terrifying anonymity of a hospital room in Charlottesville, Virginia. His body, having given everything it had to the music, simply declared bankruptcy. The doctors spoke of severe circulatory problems, of a heart that was too tired to beat, of a system overwhelmed by the cumulative trauma of the road. As he lay in that hospital bed in October 1984, the cruelty of his life's timing came into sharp focus. He was 57 years old. In the modern world, 57 is barely past middle age. B.B. King was touring well into his 80s. Willie Nelson is still on the road today. Earl Scruggs would live to be 88. But Don Reno was an old man at 57. He had lived 3 lifetimes in those years, one in the jungles of Burma, one on the radio waves of the 1950s, and one on the asphalt of the American highway system. He had used himself up. The tragedy of those final days was compounded by the financial reality. Don Reno, a man whose musical inventions had generated millions of dollars for the entertainment industry, lay dying without a fortune. There were no secret Swiss bank accounts. There were no massive royalty checks from Deliverance padding his savings. He was worried about his wife. He was worried about his sons. He was worried about how the funeral would be paid for. The poverty of the bluegrass pioneer is a stain on the history of American culture. We consume the art. We celebrate the rustic authenticity, but we allow the architects of that sound to die worrying about the electric bill. On October 16, 1984, the silence finally won. Don Reno passed away. The news did not stop the world. There were no interruptions of regularly scheduled programming. There were no flags flown at half-mast in Nashville. The New York Times ran a respectful obituary, but it was tucked away inside the paper, not on the front page. To the broader public, the millions of people who had bought Dueling Banjos records or watched the Beverly Hillbillies, the name Don Reno meant nothing. They didn't know that the sound they associated with rural America had just lost one of its primary inventors. The funeral was held in Lynchburg. It was a modest affair, appropriate for a working man. The attendees were not the glitzy stars of the new urban cowboy movement. They were the foot soldiers of bluegrass. Bill Monroe was there, the old patriarch, standing over the grave of the man he had tried to hire 40 years earlier. One can only imagine what went through Monroe's mind, the what-ifs that must have echoed in the silence. If the war hadn't happened, if Reno had joined the Bluegrass Boys in 43, how different would the history of the music have been? Musicians came from all over the region. They brought their instruments. It is a tradition in that world to send a picker home with a song. They stood around the grave and played Using My Bible for a Road Map, the gospel hit that Reno and Smiley had recorded 30 years prior. They sang the harmonies in the cool autumn air, their voices cracking with emotion. It was beautiful, but it was also stark. It was a funeral for a soldier who had died in the trenches, attended by the few who understood the war. Earl Scruggs was not there. Whether due to scheduling conflicts or the complicated, unspoken weight of their rivalry, the other king of the banjo did not stand by the grave. But Bill Harrell was there. The man who had walked away so Reno could play with his sons stood silently by the grave. He looked at the coffin of the man he had shielded from the world for a decade. Harrell knew the cost of Reno's genius better than anyone. He knew the freezing nights on the bus, the cheap food, the heartbreak of the empty seats. He stood there as the surviving witness, the keeper of the true history, carrying the weight of the silence that Reno left behind. The absence felt symbolic. Scruggs was still out there, alive, wealthy, celebrated, living in the light. Reno was going into the ground, in the dark. The dichotomy that had defined their lives, the winner and the runner-up, the icon and the outcast, held true even in death. In the immediate aftermath of his passing, the silence in the Reno household was deafening. The van sat in the driveway, cold and empty. The banjo cases were stacked in the corner, looking like small coffins. His sons, Ronnie, Dale, and Don Wayne, were left with a devastating inheritance. They didn't inherit a financial empire. They inherited a name, a technique, and a burden. They were now the keepers of the flame. They had to figure out how to navigate a world that had chewed up their father and spit him out. The Don Reno and Sons band was effectively over. Without the patriarch, the center could not hold. The boys would go on to have their own careers, carrying the lessons of their father, but the dream of the Reno dynasty overtaking the Scruggs dynasty died with Don. The momentum was lost. Cruelly, the machinery of the music industry kept grinding on as if nothing had happened. The movie Deliverance continued to play on cable television. The royalties for Dueling Banjos continued to generate revenue, flowing into the coffers of Warner Brothers and the writers credited on the lawsuit settlement. The Scruggs style continued to be the dominant method taught in every instructional book and video. Every kid who picked up a banjo wanted to play like Earl. Don Reno's single-string style was viewed as an exotic curiosity, a difficult parlor trick that was too hard to master and too weird for the mainstream. His death marked the end of an era, but it was an era that had already been fading. He was the last of a specific breed of Southern musician, men who bridged the gap between the rural string bands of the 1930s and the modern virtuosity of the jazz age. He was a link in the chain that snapped. As the dirt settled on his grave in 1984, the autopsy of his career revealed the fatal flaw. He was a man of bad timing. He was born too late to be a pioneer of the recording industry like the Carter family, and too early to benefit from the "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou" revival that would sweep the country 20 years later. He existed in the gap. He was the bridge that everyone walked across to get to the other side, but nobody stopped to admire the engineering. He died with calloused hands and a heavy heart, a miner who had dug too deep and run out of air. But in the silence of the aftermath, something strange began to happen. The music didn't disappear. It went underground. It became a secret language for the true believers. The cassette tapes of his shows began to circulate like secret scriptures among a new generation. They heard the wildness, the jazz, the refusal to conform. They realized that if Earl Scruggs was the gentle, inviting river of bluegrass, Don Reno was the treacherous, challenging mountain. History is always the fairest judge. While he was robbed of the fortune from Dueling Banjos and died in the cold indifference of his time, the artistic verdict has been overturned. He was the architect who drew the grand blueprint for modern music, the John Coltrane of the banjo, who was 40 years ahead of his time. Don Reno may have lost the material world, but he saved the soul of the music, leaving behind an immortal melody that will forever haunt the flow of history.